We are back with our lingering questions series. For those of you who missed the first two episodes of this before I went on vacation, the conceit is pretty simple. There's so much stuff that happens during the regular season that we can't hit, that we wanted to kind of swing back around and try to answer some questions that we felt didn't get the proper amount of time or energy as we got to the end of the regular season last year and even into the playoffs. So we're digging into our third iteration of that. We will have a fourth one next week. We're going to do at least four. We'll see how we're feeling after that fourth one ramps up. But I love doing these in the offseason. Very excited to get back to it. And Derrik, we've got some good ones today. These are some meaty ones with some very relevant, very high-profile teams that we're going to be digging into.
And a lot of high-profile quarterbacks, two of which who I think are consistently in the discourse for, how good do you think they are? And then we've got another
who, the word I was going to use. Divisive.
Divisive. And then we've got another quarterback who used to be fun and maybe isn't as fun anymore. So it's a very interesting group here.
Let's dig into that one first. We wanted to talk about the Kansas City Chiefs, and I feel like, remember you and I had this conversation probably mid-season last year, and we were talking about how boring the Chiefs were, and we weren't even using it in a derogatory way. It was just kind of the point at which we'd arrived with the Chiefs. They just weren't an exciting offense anymore, but they were still winning, and they were still winning in their own way. And obviously the end of last year and what happened in the Super Bowl reframes this a little bit. But the central question for me as it relates to the Chiefs in this exercise is this just what we are now with the Chiefs? Are the Chiefs just in perpetuity now going to be this grind it out, slog it out offense that has to win these games ugly? Or is there at least a glimmer of hope here that we can get back to some version of the Chiefs that, if not the high-flying group we saw in like 2018, is at least a fun, exciting offense considering who their quarterback is? So when you started digging into this, what were your initial thoughts about what we could potentially expect from the Chiefs passing offense and the Chiefs offense in general moving forward here?
I think last year was kind of a storm of like all the worst factors to not have explosive offense. First, you lose Rashee Rice like fairly early on in the season, and he's not a downfield explosive threat, but he is like throwing the ball 5 yards down the field and he can rip it off for 20 yards type of explosive threat. And so them losing that, I think, hurt. And then the run game and the offensive line in general, I think taking a step back kind of made it harder for them to even get into scenarios where they felt like attacking down the field. Like one of the things I looked at was actually they have thrown fewer passes beyond 25 yards each season going back from 2020. Like I think in 2020 it was 48 times, and then each season it like creeps down a couple of times. And I do think part of that is because they've just been in worse down and distances, especially last year. But with the running game and not being able to attack the way that they wanted to. So I think you have all of that. Xavier Worthy, I think, took forever to become what they really wanted him to be as a downfield threat and wasn't an effective one. And then Hollywood
even that,
Brown.
He really wasn't that by the end of the year. Like the most effective use of him was not the way they were using him earlier in the season when they were chucking the ball out down the field to him and he was failing to get 2 feet in bounds anytime they tried to do that.
Dude, so with that, I didn't know when we were going to hit it specifically, the Xavier Worthy thing, but I went back and watched all 12 of his deep targets. He catches the first one because it's a blown coverage in the opener where Marlon Humphrey is playing cover 2 and he thinks he's going to have safety help. There's nobody behind him. So that like doesn't even count. He catches one of the other 11 targets that he gets, and it is a really good play against the Chargers. He runs like a skinny post. Mahomes hits him perfectly. Almost all of the other misses, there are one or two where like maybe against the Niners, Mahomes actually puts one a little bit over him. So, like, there's one or two quarterback misses, but almost all of the other ones are like, it's what you mentioned where Worthy doesn't know how to get his feet in bounds. This happened multiple times. There's him not being able to get off of coverage at the end where he's, like, trying to fight with a guy on the sideline and he can't go up and get the ball. And I do think that's important specifically because for as much as we talk about like Tyreek Hill, oh, he's a unique speed threat and all this stuff. Well, Tyreek Hill's really good at getting the ball for a guy who's like 5'10", which is just not something we got from Worthy. So I think to me, that's been the biggest difference is that they just don't have guys who can win the ball down the field.
I think that's a good point with Worthy. I do want to talk about Worthy in the broader context of the offense, but just a few things for context statistically here to kind of illustrate what we're talking about with this Chiefs team. They finished dead last in explosive play rate last year. This isn't like, oh, they were a little worse than they used to be. They're a slightly below average offense in this metric. 8.4% of their plays were explosive last year, which was the lowest rate in the entire NFL. Some of that is the just complete lack of explosiveness in the run game. Even think about when their running game was solid last year. It was 4.2 yards in a cloud of dust. Like that's what Kareem Hunt is giving you at this point of the proceedings. So I think that's part of it. But the passing game was also not very explosive. They were 28th in explosive pass rate last year. And I think when we conceive of explosive plays, the first place your mind goes is pushing the ball down the field. And they were just completely unable to do that last year. I'm curious where you think Patrick Mahomes ranked in success rate on deep passes last year among all quarterbacks in the NFL.
Well, it might be last because I think I pulled up a pretty similar stat where they had an 18.2% catch rate on passes beyond 25 yards. So I don't know exactly what your cutoff for air yards was, but I'm assuming it's in that ballpark.
It was 20. It was 20 yards I was using because that's what Next Gen has. The only quarterbacks in the league with a worse deep passing success rate than Patrick Mahomes last year were Daniel Jones and Caleb Williams.
Who, one, is not good, and then two, Caleb Williams had like a historically bad season. What felt like a historically bad season down the field.
They were 10 of 41 on throws of 20-plus air yards last year. And some of the Worthy struggles are definitely part of that. If 5 of those balls get caught, if Worthy keeps his feet in on 2 of them, these numbers suddenly get a lot better very quickly. Like if 5 more of them get caught, you're at league average with some of this stuff. So I do think the variance on some of those deep throws to Worthy, you can assume that's going to get a little bit better. The other part of this, and why I think we didn't see it really in the second half of the year. If you go back and you watch all of their 20-plus air yard targets in the second half of the season, the guy who gets the most of them is DeAndre Hopkins.
Mm-hmm.
He was their most targeted deep ball receiver last year. God bless DeAndre Hopkins. In 2024, that's not what he is. And it's really not what he ever was. So I do think personnel was an issue here. So my question for you is, the fact that they didn't really have that deep threat last year because they were no longer using Worthy that way because he had to kind of be their underneath schemed up touches guy. With Rice back and Worthy kind of slotting back into that role and them getting Hollywood Brown back, do you think that there's just a natural uptick in the opportunities here where even if they're never going to be at the top of the league again, they get back to middle of the pack when those guys are relatively healthy and playing the roles they should?
I actually do. Like, if all 3 of those guys are playing, even if I think they all have limitations in their own ways, all 3 of those guys never really got to play together last year. And so this year, like you said, exactly. Like, if Rice gets to be your underneath, he's going to turn 5 into 10, whatever that guy's going to supposed to be. And then we can allow Worthy to just be a vertical stretcher in the same way that we've conceived of like Darnell Mooney at certain points. And then Hollywood Brown can really be more of your downfield guy. Whereas when he came in last year, he was running a lot of those like shallow routes and stuff because that's just kind of how the offense functioned. And he's always been decent at that. But the best versions of Marquise Brown, whether it was with the Ravens or with the Cardinals or whoever, has been him being the deep crossers, like those seam routes, like him really being able to stretch down the field. So I do think if all 3 of those guys get to play together and the offensive line takes like a slightly higher step than it was last year, I do think that that's part of it too. I think Mahomes needs to feel comfortable in the pocket. But if both of those boxes can get checked, we're not going to get back to the Tyreek Hill era of explosiveness, but they can get back to average, and average is a very far cry from where they were last year.
Yeah, and I do think, again, just natural variance with those guys being back, they're going to get close to the pack, even if they aren't going to be one of the most explosive offenses in the league anymore just by the way that they play. The Rice part of this to me is really, really important because, again, I think the first place our mind goes when we talk about explosive plays is plays down the field. But explosive plays, Yak also lends to that. Rashee Rice played essentially 3 games last year. He played in a 4th, but he was hurt very early in that game and didn't have a catch in that game. In those 3 games that he played, he had 7 receptions of 15-plus yards. 7. The Chiefs had 83 the entire season, and he had 7 in his first 3 games. If you extrapolate that over the course of the year, so he played 3 games, he had 7 of them. So you're sitting somewhere around like 38, 40 of those. Justin Jefferson led the league with 43. Jamar Chase was second with 36. So Rashee Rice was on pace to be one of the most dynamic, productive receivers in the league, and we remove him from the equation, and it completely changes the complexion of the offense. So if he's coming back even moderately healthy, I think that's going to go a really long way in changing what that passing game feels like down to down. I mean, he's a second-year guy that we've only seen for like 20 games, but he was on an absolute tear before he got hurt last year, and I think I forgot that before going back and watching all of those catches.
And that's kind of part of it too with the last 2 years of them not feeling as explosive is like towards the end of 2023, they actually were because Rashee Rice started to come along and be this sort of player. It's just that then last year, yeah, again, he only plays 3 games and we start to miss that part. And I think Rice is certainly the most important of these 3, not just because he is the best, but like him being able to be the underneath guy. Like part of the reason I didn't even love some of the underneath stuff with Worthy or even when Marquise Brown came back last year is that when you're asking those guys to do it, who the hell are you scared of down the field? Justin Watson?
Yeah,
Like 30-something-year-old DeAndre Hopkins? Like, what are we talking about here?
That's the problem for me, is that if you're asking Worthy to be that guy, now you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're hurting yourself in 2 situations. And again, most of the deep targets last year in the second half of the season were to DeAndre Hopkins and Justin Watson. It wasn't just a theoretical thing. Like, those were the down the field guys. And they had a couple of them. Like, Nuke had 2 double moves against the Raiders, but you're really trying to squeeze blood from a stone when you're trying to get deep ball targets to DeAndre Hopkins at this stage.
Well, and so that's the thing. I'm glad you mentioned double moves. If you look at whether it's Worthy, Hopkins, whoever, almost all of their successful deep balls last year were them just like they caught a corner on a double move. It was not them like somebody actually running a really nice post route and winning or making a really good contesting catch. Because if you, like you said, if you watch some of those like their 20+ air yard targets throughout the entire field to any target, Mahomes is putting a lot of those balls in a pretty good spot for the receiver to get. Like there's one that Justin Watson drops on a deep corner route. Like there's another one where he's, kind of contested and he doesn't get it right. There was another one against, I want to say maybe it was the Niners game where, or maybe it was one of the Raiders game where Watson is running up the seam and he like tries to bend it a little bit more towards the middle of the field. Mahomes throws it up the seam and it's just like, well, if that's a good player like Hollywood Brown, maybe he actually goes and makes that correct adjustment. So it's just those little things where I didn't feel like this was as much of a Mahomes problem. It was like you said, personnel-wise, a lot of this stuff just wasn't flowing the way they wanted it to.
He missed some throws down the field last year. I think part of that is that you could just tell, especially as we got deeper into the season, how uncomfortable he was in the pocket anytime he had to hold on to the ball for like more than 2.5 seconds. Sometimes there was legitimate pressure that did disrupt him in those moments, but other times I think that I want to be careful of how I say this. I'm not sure he was seeing ghosts, but I do think that there were flashes of color that were a little bit scarier to him than they would have been otherwise, given some of the pass protection issues they had earlier in the year. How do you think I did with that?
I think that was as generous as you could have put that, as safe as you could have put that without getting people a little bit irate.
All right, so you're willing to concede that with those receivers back healthy and an uptick in the left tackle play, even to like workable.
If it's like side, the 24th best tackle, that's probably fine,
so
given what we got from last year.
That's a good number to put on it. So with those circumstances in place, we think we're going to see just a natural uptick in their ability to push the ball down the field. I tend to agree with that. Here's the one element of this that I don't think we really talked about that I think is worth talking about. Mahomes is just trying to create and extend plays less than he was earlier in his career. And I do think that is creating fewer opportunities for explosiveness given what the Chiefs offense was in like 2018. I'm going to throw out a couple numbers because I do think these are really telling. In 2018, the Chiefs had 28 plays of 20+ yards when he had a time to throw of 3.5 seconds or more. 28. So it's almost 2 a game. Last year, they had 13 of those. So you're cutting that number in half. It's essentially an explosive play a game. And the guy where that shows up the most, Kelsey had 7 of them in 2018. He had 2 last year. He is just no longer an explosive piece of the offense like he was when he was younger. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge as we're wondering where the pop has gone with this entire group.
That's such a good thing to bring up because I think when we all conceive of the Tyreek Hill version of the explosive offense, one, it was, Tyreek Hill is the fastest receiver that we've probably ever seen. But then, like I mentioned, he was also really good at finding the ball deep down the field and up in the air for a receiver that size. So that was a good mesh for what Mahomes was doing at the time. But yeah, also Kelsey, he could just find him like 18 yards down the field with this weird mind meld connection that they could get to, whereas you still see that every now and then, but it really does not happen the way that it was even 3-4 years ago, where that was a peak part of the offense. And I think that's part of Kelsey obviously getting older and not being the athlete that he was, but I also think it's a couple of things with Mahomes stylistically where I think now he is I think in 20 and 2021, some of the really cool stuff he did was by virtue of not knowing what he didn't know. Where like
Yeah.
he just like he could just go do. He was like, I'm invincible. I could do whatever I want, and he played that way. And I also think the defense was just worse, so he knew that he had to score 32 points in a given game, whereas that's just not true anymore. Like he doesn't have to be the wild boy that he was 3 years ago. And I think that plays into it as well.
You're seeing that with where he's letting the ball go. So last year, they had 6 explosive plays outside of the pocket. The Chiefs did. 6. In the entire season, they had 6 of them, okay? 3 of them were to Samaje Perine. It's a real thing.
What?
Yes. 3 of those plays, half of their explosive plays outside of the pocket last year were completions to Samaje Perine, who was on the team for like 6 weeks, okay? They had 15 of those plays in 2021 and 13 in 2022. So that's just another area where we're having stuff. And if you look at just the number of times he's throwing the ball outside of the pocket, he had 96 attempts outside of the pocket last year. That was still the second most in the league. So he's still doing it more often than most quarterbacks. But go back through his recent history. In 2022, that was 117. In 2021, it was 112. In 2020, it was 125. So that's a difference of 30 attempts in one fewer game. So we're talking like twice a game. So just the opportunities to create explosive plays outside of structure, they aren't presenting themselves as often just by virtue of his play style. So I think the problem here, if you want to call it a problem, a lack of explosiveness, where it's hitting us from multiple different directions. And that's why I think you framing it as kind of a perfect storm last year of all of these factors coming together to lead to what we saw. I think that is what's going on because it's not just one thing.
Yeah, it's literally everything, which is, again, a boring answer. It would be nice to pinpoint it on one thing, but it really is everything. And I think what we mentioned a little bit, too, with the play style thing, where he was allowed to play this way the last couple of years because the defense truly became like a top 5 unit. Not just like, oh, they'll be good in the playoffs type of unit, but like a legitimately star-filled type of unit. I don't know if they're going to be that good this year. Like, I think there are a lot more questions about the defense this year, and it might be where they get to a point by the end of October where they realize, all right, Patrick, you actually do need to score 30 points a game again. And I think there's a chance that on top of what we mentioned with hopefully the receiving personnel being a little bit healthier and a little bit more explosive, and then the offensive line being even 5% better, I think we could get back to, again, the peak Kelsey Hill era is never going to happen again. But if we can get them back to average on top of them being the most efficient offense on a down-to-down basis, I mean, that's a machine.
All right. So I think that's another good way of that's a good point and a necessary point to bring up. They're still very efficient offensively, and that extends to the passing game. The success rate and how they're getting the ball out of their hands, it's impressive, and I think that's the core of what the offense is now. And I think the way they approach man coverage is a very good example of this. Like this idea that part of the reason that they've become a little less ambitious in how they're throwing the ball, it's not split safety coverages. Like that was what was happening in like 2021. They're actually seeing split safety coverages at a below average rate now because no one's really afraid of the players on that team. Like when Tyreek Hill was there in 2021, it was 47%, which was the highest rate in the league. Last year, it was like 39.8% split safety coverages. That's the same as Baker Mayfield. Like teams are not defending the Chiefs in an extreme way. That's not what's driving this. I think it's just the play style of the quarterback and who they're trying to be offensively. So I think that's important to bring up. So I think both of us believe they'll probably land somewhere in the middle of the pack if you're just playing it out 1,000 times, right? With those receivers coming back, this isn't going to be a pronounced extended problem heading into next year if guys stay healthy. So I'll frame it to you this way. Would you be more surprised if the Chiefs finish 5th in explosive pass rate next year or 27th?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually think 27th. Because I really think personnel wise, so many things went wrong for them last year and I also it's hard for me to imagine, like in a lot of ways last year felt like a down year for Mahomes, which relatively it still makes him like the 5th best quarterback in the league. It's hard for me to imagine him having like 2 quote down years in a row for him. Like I've assumed that he's going to be a lot better on top of all these other factors.
just think the way they were scheming the offense around Rice last year. I mean, just think about that week 1 game where they had him in the slot multiple times, just trying to create and dictate matchups for
Picking
him.
on Roquan Smith.
Even beyond that, Malik Harrison too.
Yeah.
Malik Harrison. Even beyond that, though, even beyond the way they're trying to structure the offense around him, when you watch him and you watch the pop he has after the catch and what he can do with the ball in his hands, even with Worthy, that's not available to the offense as soon as he gets hurt last year. And so just taking that out and removing the guy that had become, even with Kelsey in the lineup, the most important pass catcher on your team. Again, I just don't think I was reminding myself of that often enough when thinking about why the Chiefs felt like a pretty unexciting and uneventful offense for most of last season.
Yeah, and like I think for me, the difference between like what Worthy was able to do underneath and what Rice was able to bring and why they need Rice is Worthy is a nice if you throw the little bubble screens or the shallows and he can just like run as fast as he can to get to the sideline and get a few yards. Rashee Rice will take a slant and like try to run through a safety. That's a different
miss too.
Yes, exactly. He's got everything over the middle of the field, whereas like all the other guys that they were using, like Marquise Brown isn't going to do a lot for you in terms of making guys miss or running through people over the middle of the field. Like they just nobody scared you over the middle the way that would in previous years, because even Kelsey wasn't as dangerous over the middle as he has been in previous years. So it's why they need Rice.
All right, this one's already going to get us both into trouble no matter how this conversation goes. Here's the lingering question we have about the Bucs. Baker Mayfield threw 41 touchdowns last year. He finished 5th in the NFL in EPA per dropback. How real, in your mind, was the late career Baker Mayfield breakout?
Okay, before I answer the question, I want to...
He's already hedging.
It's not even a hedge. This is just like a funny thing. So if you look at the list of players who have thrown 40 touchdowns in a season, it is like all Hall of Famers. And then you have Matthew Stafford and Russell Wilson, who are like fringe cases. And then Andrew Luck, who, if not for crimes committed by the Colts organization, was on the path to me to be a Hall of Fame quarterback. So it's like some of the best quarterbacks in history. And then also Baker Mayfield last year. It's just a ridiculous list.
All right, so what's your answer? How real do you think the 41 touchdown, top 5 EPA per dropback season for Baker Mayfield was last year?
Not real, but I think him being like an above average to decent quarterback in 2023 was real. And so I think that's kind of the thing here is I think him in 2023 becoming a serious quarterback again, that part is real. And I think he's here to stay. Him being a quarterback who's capable every year of producing 35-ish touchdowns and being one of the more productive guys every single season, that I'm not so sure of. Like there were a number of things that went incredibly well around Baker Mayfield that would have allowed any quarterback to look incredibly successful last year.
All right, so what's holding you back? Well, what's keeping you more at, I think he's firmly above average. I don't think he's like a top 7 or 8 guy.
So in terms of the thing is, pressure-wise, he was playing in probably the easiest environment that we've seen the last 2 years for any quarterback. Like, so Baker Mayfield's time to throw last year was 2.85, which was a hair under the league average of 2.93. So it's not like he was holding the ball a ton necessarily, which actually that I'll start to splice in a little bit, but that's for a separate part of the conversation. But why it's interesting is Baker Mayfield last year had a 25.7% pressure rate, which over the last 2 seasons is the 4th lowest of any quarterback. The lowest is Cooper Rush in the handful of games that he played last year, and then the other 2 are obviously Tua Tagovailoa. The problem is Tua in both of those seasons was at 2.55 seconds to throw or less in each of those seasons, and Rush was at 2.62. So they're holding the ball way less than Baker was. So they're getting pressured way less than he was. So Baker is like holding the ball at about an average rate, but getting pressured way, way less than anybody else. And I think he took advantage of that, obviously. But when you're living that cushy, like it's pretty easy to just like, hey, Mike Evans is down there somewhere.
I think the environmental factors are really important to point out on a bunch of different levels. The pass protection for the Bucs last year was very, very good. It's just a great offensive line that was playing at a high level for almost the entire season, led by an all-pro tackle and really no weak links across the board. You got
like
Bredesen
all of
having
those
a career
guys
year.
are solid.
Mock take a significant step forward. Barton, I think, is potentially going to be a star. So you felt very good about that unit. The other environmental thing that I think is worth bringing up is just the health of the screen game and how that, to me, is indicative of what the offense felt like overall. So they were 9th in screen rate last year. They didn't throw them at an absurd level, but the success they had on those plays 20.5 total EPA on screens for Baker Mayfield last year. That was the second highest mark in the league per next gen. The league average is -2. So they got, I mean, you just think about that. It's like we're talking 3 touchdowns more from screens alone for the Bucs last year. It's one of the best screen games I can remember watching. And even beyond that, I mean, you had a lot of like those 41 touchdowns. I went back and watched all of them today. You had a lot of underneath throws that were walk-in touchdowns. And I think the other side of this, the red zone quality from this team last year, I don't think I really appreciated it in the moment to the same degree that I appreciated the screen game. And then you go back and you watch those 41 touchdowns today, and it's a Liam Cohen masterclass. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous. They had a 53.7% passing success rate in the red zone last year, the Bucs did. Only 27 teams since 2000 have hit 53%, okay? So we're talking about maybe one team a year hitting that 53.7% success in the red zone. Some of the teams we're talking about among those 27, we got 5 Breeze Saints teams. We got 3 Peyton Manning teams, the 2018 Chiefs, the 2020 Packers, last year's Ravens, the 2013 Broncos are in there. Like, these are Hall of Fame MVP seasons. And I think you saw that last year, the amount of motion and misdirection in the red zone from like the 25 and in, and how easy some of those completions were. It was incredible. And I don't want to take away from Baker Mayfield in talking about that, but I think it's really important to acknowledge just how ridiculous the design of this offense was for a vast majority of last season, and how relatively easy that made some of the plays that this quarterback had to make.
Yeah, it was one of the most well-designed and, to me, well-taught offenses. And this is actually a part where I do want to give Baker Mayfield some of his credit, is that in 2023, Baker Mayfield was throwing the ball down the field all the time. It was a very like drop back, we're going to throw intermediate all the time. His air yards dropped significantly in 2024 to about 7.0, which is firmly below average, almost a yard below average. Part of that is the screen game. Like you mentioned, they threw a decent amount of them, nothing crazy. But a lot of that, too, to me, was Baker just being like, okay, if the first thing in the play call is not there that Liam Cohen has hooked up, I'm just going to, boom, get to my check down. He was so much faster at doing that this year, and he was so much faster at becoming a scrambler. On a cumulative EPA basis, this was his best season as a scrambler. And you saw that because he was just quicker to pull the ripcord and be like, if this is not the way I want it to, I'm not going to dance around and hold the ball in the pocket the way that I used to 2 years ago. I'm just going to get out of here and go. And so I think there was a very clear, I don't know if how much of it is Baker, how much of it was Liam Cohen teaching him this, but there was a very clear, like, we're just going to get through the play as quickly as possible and get something out of it. And they did it. It was a good marriage because of that.
I 100% agree with that. And I think it extends to a bunch of different things. There was a touchdown to Jalen McMillan at the end of the season. It was like the second or third last game of the year. They had one of the running backs, I want to say it was Bucky Irving, went in motion to the right, and they faked a little swing screen. And the first option was Evans releasing on a fake screen to that side. We've seen that play a million times in the NFL over the last 5 years. You fake a screen, the guys who are faking a stock block, they release, you hit them down the field, it's an easy completion. I think it was the Panthers snuffed it out, and Baker gets back to the backside in breaker to Jalen McMillan for a touchdown, and he gets there fast. And there are a lot of those plays as the field condenses. I think a lot of their red zone success was based on design and just very well-constructed offense. A lot of it was based on the touch he had on a lot of throws in the red zone and how quickly he was getting to alternative options in the red zone. So I do think that's a really good thing to point out. Just clearly the intention behind all of these plays was well communicated to the quarterback, and he deserves a lot of credit for executing that stuff. The scramble part of this is hugely important, because if we're trying to separate the Baker contributions to this and the schematic environmental contributions to this, what he did under pressure last year, that is the biggest difference between 2024 Baker Mayfield and any of the versions of Baker Mayfield we had ever seen. Last year, Baker Mayfield led the league in dropback success rate when pressured. He led the NFL in that stat. He was third in EPA per dropback when pressured, behind Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen. That's it. Those are the only two guys on a per dropback basis who were better when pressured last year than Baker Mayfield in terms of value. If you go back and look at the last 5 years, same stat, EPA per dropback when pressured. Dead last in 2022. bottom 4 in 2021, bottom 6 in 2020, and bottom 10 in 2019. So that is the biggest difference between last year's Baker Mayfield and the Baker Mayfield we had gotten essentially since his rookie year in 2018. Is for the most part, when he was pressured, bad things happened. He led the league in pressure to sack rate multiple times. He took too many of them. He was not an efficient scrambler. The only players last year to provide more value on scrambles when pressured in the NFL last season were Jaden Daniels, Jalen Hurts, and Kyler Murray.
Wow.
Those are the only ones.
That's actually insane.
That's it. And so I do think he deserves a ton of credit for that. So I think it's not an interesting answer, but it's a little bit of both. Like there's a little bit of the Bucs offense doing a lot of heavy lifting, but I also think there are some areas, and they're volatile areas. There's a chance he doesn't continue doing this in these areas. But last year specifically, what he did when things broke down, we have never seen him contribute to the game in this way when things around him start to get a little bit dirty.
Yeah, I took a very similar approach. For me, it wasn't under pressure. It was like something very adjacent, which was throwing outside of the pocket. He had a .23 EPA per dropback outside of the pocket, which was, I mean, that's incredible numbers for any split, and a 57.1% success rate on throws outside of the pocket, which was the third best in any season since 2019 by any player. And so he was extremely, extremely not just getting the explosives outside of the pocket, because we've seen seasons before where like a guy's just randomly chucking it up outside of the pocket sometimes, and it works like that Joe Flacco season 2 years ago when he was just moving outside and chucking it. But that's not really what Baker was doing. He was like actually efficient and confident. And so I would expect that to come down. Obviously, I don't think he's a player that can sustain that level of outside of the pocket success. But I do think when you watched him last year, he clearly had a better idea of what plan B actually was and how to get there and how to make throws from slightly different and uncomfortable platforms that I think he wasn't as good at a few years ago, and especially early in his career. So again, I think there's a lot of the environmental factors that raised him up, but it's not taking him from like bad to good. It's taking him from good to great, where you can have 40 touchdowns in a season. I really do think that he's made some strides that, again, I don't know if he's a consistent 40 touchdown guy, but I do think like he's here to stay.
I think that's a really good way of laying it out. Because if you look at all the things that went right for them last year, again, when you think about just the quiet ways the offense was efficient, he was 7th in the percentage of his yardage that came with yak last year. And you felt that when you watched that team. I want to say half of it was in that Saints game, where
the Chris Godwin game,
the Chris Godwin 55-yard underneath completion, and then the Tucker 30, that was like a 40-yard touchdown that was an underneath throw, but again, a ton of yak. It was right there with like Jared Goff. And when you think about the Lions offense, that's just a feature of the Lions offense. Like they're just going to get a ton of yak yardage based on the way that they play. And I think the Bucs were finding yardage in similar ways. The screen game and how valuable that was. And then all the things he did under pressure and how valuable those plays were in a way that they used to be the opposite of that. I think as all of that stuff normalizes to a level that you can reasonably expect, potentially he goes from like 5th in EPA per dropback last year with a new offensive coordinator to like 10th in EPA per dropback this year. And I still think that is a very good outcome if you are the Bucs with a first-year offensive coordinator and a quarterback that you are paying pretty far below market value compared to guys that I think are reasonably in his tier right now. Like I think he's probably sniffing around where the Brock Purdy's and Jared Goff's and Tua's and all those guys are, and he's getting paid 60% as much of those guys. So right now, this entire situation with Baker Mayfield in Tampa, I think is an objective win for where the Bucs are and where they want to go with this iteration of the team.
Exactly. Like if in theory his floor with the Bucs is that 4,000 yard 28-10 season that he had in 2023, then that's a pretty good outcome. Like, again, it's probably never again going to be as good as 2024, but if he can at least be some degree slightly better than 2023 consistently, which I do think the more that he is allowed to play and really continue to mature in this offense and in this environment that he can, like, for the money he's getting paid, man, he's a pretty solid value.
The scrambling part, the last thing I want to say about this is that I think it's a really good lesson for why quarterbacks can be good scramblers. Like Baker Mayfield isn't a better athlete now than he was in 2018 when he came into the league. Yeah, he thinks he's a great athlete, and good for him. I remember, what was it? I think it was the Lions game where he had like a 10-yard rushing touchdown. It was the longest one in his career. And somebody told him that after the game. And he's like, son of a, that's embarrassing.
He's like, really?
but he shakes that one off. Like that one rolls off his back and he never remembers it again. But I think that the ability to recognize when to take off in the situations where that's advantageous, that's something that you can hone and develop as you get a little bit deeper into your career. And I think, Baker came into the league fairly old. And I think Baker's been a character in our lives for so long that, similar to the conversation we had on the mailbag yesterday, you just think about Baker even coming into his Bucs tenure being like, I know what Baker Mayfield is. He's only 30. Like, he just turned 30. This is his age 30 season. So seeing some of this stuff start to get a little bit sharper between the ears for him at this stage of his career, with offensive coaches 2 years in a row that have gotten head coaching jobs, and I think clearly have done a very good job of developing that communication and trust with the quarterback, it's not shocking, or at least it shouldn't be, for us to see this sort of progression from him, even if it seems like we've known who Baker Mayfield is for a very long time.
Exactly. And like, he's still going to do some of the boneheaded Baker stuff. Like, he throws the same interceptions all the time, which is like, he thought he saw something pre-snap. He's going to hang on to it and he's going to throw it. Oops, I was wrong. I threw it right at a safety. He's still going to keep doing that. But if in between those moments, he can have more plays where he's able to get to the backside and throw that dig, or he's able to just more consistently get to the check down or pull the ripcord on an efficient scramble, then we're cooking. Because 3 years ago, it was like you got a lot of those bad interceptions and throws, and then in between it was him taking sacks, him overthrowing guys on the sideline, all that sort of stuff. Like, he's pieced together all the in-between moments in a way that's it's been pretty cool to see. I enjoy Baker Mayfield in a way that 2 years ago I really did not think I ever would again.
I feel the exact same way. And I think I started realizing that about halfway through his first season with the Bucs, where I was just like, I'm liking this. It's not dissimilar. I can't remember what point in the season it was, or even what season it was. I'm sure you remember listening to the show, but Nate and I were talking about Jared Goff. And
Jared Goff, yeah.
I just had that moment where I was like, you know what? I like watching Jared Goff, and I don't care who knows it. And I think that I had a somewhat similar experience with Baker about halfway through that 23 season. And then going back and watching all of it today, it's like, part of it, I think, is the warm and fuzzy feelings I got watching the offense. Like, if you go back and watch every Jalen McMillan touchdown, it's just a highlight reel of like what Liam Cohen did last year. I don't know if he's going to be a good head coach. It's a very different job, but I don't want whatever happens in Jacksonville to color our understanding of what the 2024 Bucs offense was. It was one of the best coordinated single units I have watched, I think, since I started doing this job. And so that was a fun reminder while rewatching today. But I think the Baker enjoyment part of it is also very prominent every time I go back and watch this team, because I really do appreciate what he is right now.
He's just... And that's the thing. In 2023, I thought it was like kind of fun and silly. And then this year, even though, again, he was being helped by the offense a lot, this year I was like, no, he's actually, I like it because it's good. And the last thing I want to say is that going back and watching him studying for this, I watched the Giants game. I forget which week it was. They are cruising for the entire game. And like, part of it is him making a couple of good throws. Part of it is the offense is just unlocking stuff. But they end up at like 3 scores in the fourth quarter. One, he just starts trying like late in the game for no reason. There's no reason to be making a 20-yard corner throw when you're up 3 scores, but he's like, what if I can do it? But then there's also a moment where I think it's either an outside run or maybe he throws a screen to somebody, but he runs in the fourth quarter up 3 scores and makes a block at the 50-yard line for his guy. I'm like, that's cool, man. I know that's cheesy and that's like some football movie stuff, but like, it was just like, I kind of love a player that's willing to go do that.
It's pretty crazy. I was pulling up the numbers as you were talking. He's 19th in AAV among quarterbacks. 19th. It's really hard for quarterbacks on extensions to be underpaid unless you're in the Josh Allen Mahomes thing right now, or before Josh Allen got his most recent extension, but like, you got paid and then the market exploded and you haven't gotten your next contract. Like, that's really the only circumstance where quarterbacks on these extensions are drastically underpaid. But if you look at what Baker is making compared to the field and where he slots in among these guys, it really is a bargain for what he is providing the Bucs, even if we do think there's probably a cap of where he can eventually fall within the pecking order.
Yeah, you said what, 19th? if I had to rank the quarterbacks right now, he'd probably be higher than 19. So that's a win.
Don't do that, because we'll be doing that soon enough, I'm sure, because it's June and that's coming. That's coming around the bend. So when we get there, I'm sure he will be higher than 19th, no matter how that ultimately shakes out. This is, to me, very much in the spirit of the exercise, right? We watched the Niners last year. You kind of write them off halfway through the season, watch them out of the corner of your eye. We know the season's over. And the easy way to bucket the Niners 2024 season is, they were hurt, season from hell type stuff. They were banged up. And it's tempting and just, natural to kind of leave it at that. And then we start the discourse about what the 2025 Niners season is going to be. So here's my lingering question about the 2024 Niners. Are there potential issues with who they are and where they're going on offense that extend beyond the injuries they endured on that side of the ball last year? What do you make of that?
See, the injuries thing is tricky because I think the injuries played a big part of why they were bad last year. But the injuries are going to be a problem for them next year.
They weren't bad.
Right.
They were 9th in offensive DVOA. Purdy was 7th in EPA per dropback. I think that's worth at least acknowledging as we try to contextualize what their season was last year. They weren't as good as they had been previously. They were not bad.
They were definitely not bad. And actually, the more I kind of looked at this and studied it, I actually kind of appreciated Purdy, I think, more than I probably ever have.
I feel the exact same way.
In part because of some of the injuries and what he actually had to do to make this offense work. But the injury thing is complicated because, yes, it hurt them last year, but Trent Williams isn't going to get any younger. Brandon Ayuk is hurt again, or he's going to be hurt. Ricky Pearsall is hurt again. And we have no idea if Christian McCaffrey is going to look good next year. Yep. So we can't really say that the injury stuff was isolated. But I think to kind of answer the question of is there anything else systemic to what they're doing that is kind of a problem? This offensive line is bad. Even when it has Trent Williams, it's not very good. And then certainly when they didn't have him last year, it was not very good. They have, other than Williams, I would say one starter who is at least an average player. And that was Dominic Pooney last year, who even then, he was good for a rookie. I wouldn't say that he was an outwardly good player yet.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the biggest issue with them when you're looking at his contributions last year is in one-on-one situations, he could more than hold up. Any twists or stunts where that interior had to do work together was a consistent issue. And I think that if I'm trying to figure out systemic issues here, I think that's probably the first place I would start with stuff that is demonstrably bad. I think there's a lot of stuff that was different about them last year, and we can talk about whether that's bad or good and put a value judgment on it. Something that is objectively bad is that I think this team has some cracks in the foundation when it comes to pass protection. The stunts and twists are part of it. The only two quarterbacks last year per next gen to see more unblocked pressures than Brock Purdy were Caleb Williams and CJ Stroud.
Oh, man.
The men who oversaw those offenses were fired after the season was over.
And the other one we think is a genius.
Yes. So that to me is what I would go back to. And I think there's probably a larger study to be done here. And I hesitate to even throw this out because I think it's a good idea. I think that we need to do a little bit of conscious looking at whether the Shanahan offense in general, the rigidity of it pre-snap is leading to issues because teams have figured out how to manipulate it because it's not nimble enough to account for the ways that some teams can manipulate that stuff.
I think it might be, and I think it's for a couple of reasons. One, this offense, because it can be a little bit more simple, I think you almost need to just avoid clear pass situations by running the ball effectively, and that is something that for parts of last year they kind of struggled with, especially compared to 2023 when Christian McCaffrey was healthy. So I think that plays into a part of it, and they were also, I know towards the end of last year they actually became more of a play action under center team, but in general, they've done less of that with Purdy than they ever did with Jimmy Garoppolo, and I think that
was the seventh lowest mark in the league last year. They used play action on 20.2% of their dropbacks. Purdy finished one spot below Joe Burrow,
who famously hates all of that.
I mean, I was looking at the numbers. 2020 was the last season where the Niners were decidedly above average in play action rate. I think that we conceive of the Niners as a specific type of offense, and that hasn't been true in a very long time. I think last year it was just taken to a different sort of extreme than we had really seen since like the last time we saw Jimmy. Jimmy was also at like 20% his last time when he was a starter before Purdy went in there after he got hurt.
Right, because that was when they had CMC, and that's
Exactly.
like when they got CMC, it started to change. And that's kind of the other part of this is that without Christian McCaffrey last year to either be an obvious weapon in the passing game or to be one of the better pass protecting backs in the league, they always have to do some bull if they want another pass protector. Like there were a lot of snaps last year where they brought in Kyle Juszczyk to just like be the running back on third down, which is like there's no ambiguity at that point about like if that guy's going to be in pass protection anymore. So it's almost a little bit easier to manipulate their rules or get into certain coverage calls and stuff like that. Whereas when it's Christian McCaffrey, it's if you're wrong about him being in pass protection or being a receiver, you're going to be very wrong and it's going to hurt you. Probably going to hurt you less if that player is Kyle Juszczyk. And then they didn't trust any of the other backs to do it all that well. Like Jordan Mason, I don't think was very good at it. Isaac Guerrero was a young player. He wasn't very good at it. Patrick Taylor they were using like pretty exclusively to do some of that, and he wasn't even great at it. So I do think them losing the versatility and safety of McCaffrey as a third down player hurt them a lot in those scenarios.
So the play action part of this has been something that's been building. So that's not necessarily a hard left turn. There are some other areas though where it's a little more extreme last year. When you think about the 2024 Niners compared to previous iterations of this team, even post CMC, Purdy last year threw 11.6% of his attempts behind the line of scrimmage per next gen. Okay. The gap between that and Jalen Hurts at second to last was bigger than Jalen Hurts and the 7th lowest mark in the league. Like they were in their own zip code in terms of how often they were throwing the ball behind the line of scrimmage. The only quarterbacks last year to throw to open receivers less often per next gen than Brock Purdy was Russell Wilson, who was on a team with no one that could separate, and Bryce Young, who was on a team with absolutely no one that could separate. So this all just felt very, very hard in terms of what they were trying to get out of the passing game. My question for you is, do you think that is a temporary situation caused by a combination of injury and a transition in the style of the offense? Or do you think this is going to be something that potentially persists even when they get some of these guys back?
I mean, it's the same offensive line, and I don't know if CMC is going to be that good next year. So that is kind of where I start to... And again, I don't know if the receiving core is going to be that much better next year. Like, the only move they really made was getting Demarcus Robinson, who, like, is a nice depth piece to have, but I don't know if that's going to solve any of this stuff. They're really banking that Brandon Ayuk and Ricky Pearsall are going to be healthier next year. And like, if Pearsall is, like, he did play really well at the end of last year, and there's a chance that he becomes a really nice player for them. But like, with him again having some of the injury stuff, I just get a little bit, antsy there. I do want to say one thing though. For Purdy throwing into like not open receivers all that much, I think that's a little bit self-inflicted. He's an incredibly aggressive passer, and he's also, truthfully, he's not that accurate. He gets the ball where it needs to be by virtue of like anticipating well and generally throwing to the right receiver. But his like precise ball location, to me, leaves a lot to be desired. And that's why he kind of needs guys like George Kittle and a healthy Brandon Ayuk to bail him out is the wrong word because he gives them good chances, but help him out a little bit. You know, it's a very transactional relationship between those two.
So let's just say that McCaffrey does not come back healthy. Okay. If we're just building a fictional scenario here, let's say McCaffrey is out of the lineup / banged up for a good majority of next year. I don't think that's a crazy thing to put forth based on how last season went. Let's say Ayuk comes back 5-6 games into the year and the receiving core stays relatively healthy. So you have Ayuk, Jennings, Kittle, Pearsall, and like you're working with most of the guys you came into the season with, and the offensive line plays at a reasonable level and stays healthy for most of the year. What do you think structurally this version of the Niners offense playing the way that they played last year with those receivers needs to do better and needs to do well for them to maximize whatever this model looks like?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it would probably have to be them finding some sort of answer. It's like, to me, with pass protection, especially on third downs and stuff like that. Because like you said, it's usually pretty easy to game them up. Like you just, because they they run a lot of 5-man protections, or like I said, if they add another guy, it's Juszczyk coming in to play running back. And I think at that point, it becomes very easy to manipulate. If they can get Jordan James to walk in and help with some of that stuff, or even if McCaffrey's not that healthy, if he can at least stay on the field and help you be a little bit more flexible in terms of where your pass protection is coming from, I think that would help a lot. I also think when you watch them on third down, even though we conceive of Shanahan and this offense being really good with like motion and stacks and moving guys around, on their pure pass scenarios, it's actually not all that impressive to me. And I think they kind of rely that Purdy is just going to like make a throw over the middle of the field regardless. And they don't do as much work to me on like third downs of actually scheming guys open with motion and all this other stuff. For example, like Zach Robinson and the Falcons, I thought last year did a much better job of that than Shanahan did in those scenarios.
If you're going to be a pure drop back team more often than not, especially in those pure pass situations, you need to make the levers a little bit easier to pull for your guys in those scenarios. I think that's a totally fair thing to point out. I'm going to frame it this way, and I'm curious what you think about this. When I watched the Niners last year, it felt like the first time in a while where they were no longer dictating to defenses how the game was going to go. And I think you felt that just by what they looked like on the field down to down, but I also think the numbers bear that out. So in 2023, the Niners faced single high coverages 61.1% of the time. That is the second highest mark in the league. The only team that was ahead of them was the Ravens. And think about the structure of the Ravens offense and how they want to play. So that was in 2023. Last year, they faced single high coverages on 51.8% of dropbacks, which was actually below league average. So we're talking like a drop of 10 percentage points from 2023 to 2024. If you look at specific coverages, in 2023, they 36% of their dropbacks were against cover 3, which was the highest mark in the league. It was 39% on early downs. In 2024, it was 28% cover 3 on early downs, which was actually the 5th lowest mark in the league. So you go from being at the top of the league in the simplicity of the defenses you're going to face on early downs and your understanding of how to manipulate those defenses to defenses that are much more of a Rolodex and are much harder for you to manipulate. So I guess my question is that a product of teams not loading up the box quite as often because Christian McCaffrey is not playing? Or is this just going to be the way the defenses are playing against the Niners moving forward? And are they able to get back on the front foot in a way that they were never really able to establish last year because they were playing catch up a little bit? I think that's the central question for me.
So to me, I think it's actually that part of it is a little bit less about McCaffrey, because I looked at something similar with Trent Williams's on and off splits. When Trent Williams was when he was playing the first 10 games of the season, they were third in yards before contact. They were like they weren't as explosive as they were because obviously they didn't have McCaffrey, but they were a very efficient rushing offense still. When he was not on the field the last 7 weeks of the season, they were 23rd, which was sandwiched between the Chargers and the Patriots, who not good at running the ball last year, not very effective rushing offenses. And so I think, to me, like, if they can just get back to Trent Williams, again, he's getting older, so it's a little bit scary, but if he can stay on the field, and then I think why this is all interesting to me too, when Williams was on the field and they were decent at running the ball early last year, Brandon Ayuk was still not very good. He was still coming back from some stuff, and Pearsall wasn't playing at all. And even Debo was a little bit on and off the field. Now, again, I know Ayuk is probably not going to play for early parts of this season this year, but if Pearsall can just play a little bit better and more consistently, and Demarcus Robinson can give them anything and just stay on the field, and Williams can stay on the field, it's like, okay, if you have more of this stuff together and you can actually run the ball a little bit more effectively, and Pearsall takes any degree of a step, we might be headed in the right direction again.
So where do you land on the answer to the initial question? Like, how much do you think that their relative slide last year, again, to the back half of the top 10 instead of earth-shattering, is a product of injuries? And how much do you think it's a product of ecosystem? And what do you think they potentially look like this year if they have average health on that side of the ball? Are we talking about the third best offense in the league, or are we talking about like the 8th or 9th best offense in the league?
I think, to me, if Ayuk comes back, like by the time we get to, and he comes back relatively healthy, we get to mid-November, I think it's more likely they're a top 5 offense than not. That's, I think, where I land.
And if the defense can not be
if they can do anything,
5 unit,
yes,
I think
they'll be a good team again.
I think
they could win 10 games.
I'm wondering, and this is the last thing I'll say about this. I wonder how much of this is, they'll figure it out, benefit of the doubt stuff, and how much of it is us not wanting to be a year too early on that, where it's a silly way of thinking about it because they've been so good. Are we really going to let one mildly disappointing season ravaged by injury cause us to overreact and project a further slide this year? I think that's my only concern, is that my instinct is to be like, they'll probably be fine. And I wonder how much of that is overriding some of the information that's in front of me.
Well, and that's tricky too, because like we've seen them have a mediocre season before and then bounce back and be the best in the league again. But it's also like some of the factors this time are a little bit different because, again, Williams is older and now Debo's out of the building and all this other stuff. So it does feel a little bit scarier. But I think even though I would say I still have a lot of faith in Shanahan. I would say I probably have 5% less right now, not because I think of him any less, but because they're trying to be more of a drop back offense. Like that's not his realm. So that gives me some degree of ick, but I actually think Brock Purdy is good enough. And if Trent Williams is on the field and if Pearsall comes back relatively healthy, like I think they'll be somehow better than they were last year, which again was still the 8th or 9th best offense in the league. And if you're better than that and the defense isn't embarrassing, you're a good team again.
Yeah, and again, I haven't lost faith in Kyle Shanahan's ability to do this. I do just think it's notable that last year was the first time in a while where it felt like they didn't have the pen last all the time. They were reacting and scrambling a little bit based on what defenses were doing to them instead of the reverse of that, instead of the inverse, which it had seemed to be for multiple years in a row. And we've seen this happen. Like this happened with the Rams, where there were seasons where they were on their back foot. They were no longer dictating the terms anymore. Sometimes those are just going to creep up when you have moments of transition because your personnel changes or teams are playing you a little bit differently. And I do think that's what last season was for the Niners. At the end of the year, the numbers had changed a little bit. I remember like halfway through the season when teams are playing like 60% man coverage against them on third down, like that started to fall back to the middle of the pack a little bit. But those early down and just overall coverage menus that they were not seeing in previous years. Like Purdy was really, really good again last year against cover 3 looks. So he was 5th in success rate against cover 3 last year. He was 15th against some of those 2 high looks. So when the things get a little bit more complicated on defense and the answers to the test aren't just laying there in front of you because you're the one dictating, it's going to look a little bit messier at times. And I do think that's what last season was a little bit for the Niners, even independent of some of the injuries.
I think that's completely fair. And I even though when I watched a lot of what Purdy was doing, especially on purely third downs last year, because I was looking about how they were protecting, there are still moments against some of those teams that do a lot of the edge dropping stuff where I think he has some issues with that. But I think I have some degree of faith in him moving forward that he'll be able to get better at that stuff. One, because he's a better player now than he was when he first took over the job. But he also plays fast. Like he's not a guy who dawdles, which to me suggests that like he is going to be able to continue to learn. So I don't know. I guess it's just years of faith in Kyle Shanahan, me coming away a little bit more impressed with Purdy, and then hoping that Trent Williams doesn't hit the age cliff this year is basically where I'm at.
And then McCaffrey's almost like an added bonus, no matter what you
He's
get. He's
cherry on top at this point.
But when it comes to Shanahan and Purdy, I think I land in a similar range where it's like, I have faith in Kyle Shanahan to get to the other side of this. And I do think that Brock Purdy probably had the most impressive season he's had last year, even if the raw numbers aren't quite as good as they had been the last couple seasons.
Can I also say, too, for as much as we just spent like 20 minutes talking about the offense, if the defense was not embarrassing last year and this team wins 9 games, how much of this conversation are we even having?
Probably not. And again, the special teams disasters and just all the coin flip shut and stuff. It was the season from hell. And I do think it's important not to overreact to seasons from hell when you have a lot of earned equity from the teams that endure those seasons. And I think that's exactly where the Niners are. All right. That is all we've got for today. We will be back with the 4th and potentially final installment of this series next week. There's a chance that we find a couple more lingering questions just hanging out in the couch cushions. So we reserve the right to do another one of these if we see fit. But we have at least one more coming next week. Tomorrow, we haven't picked a conference. We're going to do one of the conferences. We're going to be ranking these supporting casts for quarterbacks in the league. We're going to be talking about receiving cores, offensive line, and coaching, right? I think that's something when we did the exercise last year, some people thought I was over-indexing who the play caller was. I had the Vikings like third or fourth in the NFC, and people thought I was crazy. And then Sam Darnold just made $100 million, so I feel kind of justified about that. So we're going to consider all of the factors associated with these teams and rank all 32 supporting casts over 2 different shows over the next 2 weeks. So we're going to be doing the first one of those tomorrow, so please come back and check that out. For now, that's all we got. Appreciate you guys listening. We'll talk to you very soon. Thanks for watching The Athletic Football Show. Subscribe to the channel to keep up with us. Like and comment on this video, and we'll see you next time.